The story of the Royal Canadian Air Force begins on England's Salisbury Plain, winds its way across the Canadian hinterland, struggles through a maze of politics and bureaucracy, and ultimately triumphs in the dark and stormy skies of a world war. During the last century, Canada's Air Corps has come and gone, grown and shrunk, administered civil aviation and defended security, freedom, and democracy. It has delivered mail, mapped the Canadian North, licensed and regulated pilots, monitored aircraft development, and patrolled offshore waters. It has rescued the lost and the threatened, fought wars, enforced peace, and delivered life-saving relief to desperate populations in the far reaches of the planet. Now, 100 years on, elements of the RCAF are turning their continuously searching eyes to space, where satellite security and reliability have become critical concerns in the ever-expanding digital age. The RCAF that we know today is the fourth iteration of an Air Force in Canada. The first of them was created at the outset of the First World War. But the Canadian Aviation Corps was an unmitigated disaster for its creator, Colonel Sam Hughes, the corrupt and incompetent Minister of Militia and Defense at the time. The CAC was an Air Force in name only. It consisted of 3 personnel, 2 officers, neither of whom were qualified to fly, and a mechanic. There was just 1 aircraft, a rudimentary float plane. Cashing in on a political debt, Ernest Lloyd Janney had persuaded Hughes to commission him a captain, appoint him the Corps commander, and give him $5,000 to buy the plane. The aircraft was ultimately left abandoned, a heap of worthless junk on Salisbury Plain, having never flown a single combat op. Janney then went on an unauthorized tour of British airfields and aircraft factories. He was listed as absent without leave. With his Air Corps, such as it was, in tatters, he appealed to the federal government for more money to form a squadron. Janney's chutzpah only carried him so far. His bid was rejected, and he was ordered home, stripped of his commission, and forced to resign in disgrace in December 1914. The CAC was dissolved 8 months after it was formed. Janney eventually ended up facing charges in the United States after he tried to start an aircraft manufacturing company on borrowed money and little expertise. By 1932, he had disappeared from public view, only to return as war clouds mustered again over Europe in September 1939. The colorful erstwhile commander of the country's first, albeit short-lived Air Force, sent a message to Ottawa. "I'm still full of the old pep," he said. "Let me know what I can do." The first Canadian Air Force was formed about the same time as Britain's Royal Air Force, which replaced the Royal Flying Corps in 1918. But CAF pilots were still in training when the war ended and never flew combat under the Canadian banner. The wartime CAF didn't last. Post-war, Canada's political leadership and key military brass were unconvinced of aviation's potential role in the country's defense, and overall, defense spending was on the wane. Still, in 1919, Canada became the first country to comprehensively legislate aviation, implementing rules and regulations governing all flight within its borders. The powers that be recognized that the country's vast expanse, isolated communities, and widely distributed populace would be well served by a strong civil aviation industry, both commercial flight and aircraft manufacturing. An air board was formed to administer it and devise a rudimentary air defense plan. So, in 1920, a new Canadian Air Force was formed, a small air militia charged with providing 28-day refresher courses to veterans. But its role, even its permanence, was anything but certain. Historian Alec Douglas wrote that Canada's need for an Air Force was not readily identifiable. After the war to end all wars, the country faced no discernible external threat. Canadians, Douglas wrote, had little appreciation of the potential of air power and little enthusiasm for expenditures on such esoteric military commitments. There was no institutional tradition for an Air Force to build upon. Some 1,271 airmen and 550 officers passed through the CAF training program before it was shut down on March 31, 1922. A short time later, the Air Board itself was merged with the Department of Militia and Defense and the Department of Naval Service to form the Department of National Defense. It would be another 16 months before the emergence of what today would be a more recognizable and permanent Air Force. Prime Minister Robert Borden especially resisted the concept of a military air component for years. His cabinet knew virtually nothing about aviation's potential role in national defense. Nevertheless, his government, acting on the recommendations of its delegate to a key Paris conference on aviation, Borden's Inland Revenue Minister Arthur Sifton, resisted European control over flight. Sifton recognized that the cluster of European countries, each with its own borders and airspace, had different priorities from Canada, with its wide-open spaces, single international border, and remote communities, which were growing and fast becoming dependent on the airplane for food and supply. Still, air defense took a back seat. It was under newly minted Prime Minister Mackenzie King, who in opposition once said, "An air service for military purposes is the height of absurdity," that a permanent Air Force came to be. The CAF received its royal designation on April 1, 1924. The ostensibly new service was handed responsibilities more akin to what today would be considered more civilian than military. Jobs like forest patrols and firefighting, aerial surveys and photography, exploration, rescue, crop dusting, and policing the skies. For 15 years, RCAF personnel did everything from registering civil aircraft and controlling the airspace to supervising the design and construction of machines, all while attempting to stimulate a national aviation industry. Militarily, however, the Air Force continued to languish, especially during the Depression of the 1930s. It faced a constant struggle to maintain an efficient air defense force with little money, limited personnel, and antiquated equipment, along with continued disregard from the politicos and mucky-mucks in Ottawa. It took a world war to bring the RCAF into its own. As the rumblings of impending conflict in Europe grew louder, the defense budget soared. The RCAF allotment in 1936 was $4.6 million. A year later, it skyrocketed to nearly $30 million. That's a whopping 1,614% over its annual budget of the early 1930s. In February 1939, the RCAF acquired 19 first-generation Hawker Hurricane fighters. By the time Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, Canada's emerging Air Force had grown to some 20 squadrons and more than 4,000 personnel. In the spring of 1940, No. 1 Squadron, RCAF, headed to England to help defend the home islands against Nazi invasion. More than 100 Canadian pilots were killed during the Battle of Britain. The RCAF and Canadians flying with the RAF had become an indelible part of Churchill's feud. They had forged Canada's place in military aviation. No. 1 Squadron was renamed 401 and finished the war with 186.5 aerial victories, far and away the most of any RCAF unit. A new era of air warfare had begun, and Canadian airmen and ground crew played no small part in it. Between 1939 and 1945, the RCAF enlisted 232,000 men and 17,000 women. It mounted 86 squadrons and dispatched 47 of them overseas. RCAF personnel crewed bomber, fighter, reconnaissance, transport, and other missions around the world. Tens of thousands of Canadian air crew also served with the RAF, and more than 17,000 Canadian airmen were killed in action, more than 10,600 of them with Bomber Command. By 1944, Canada's Military Aviation Corps had grown into the world's fourth largest air force. While the years ahead would present new challenges, the RCAF would languish no more. Canadian pilots would fight with American squadrons, and transport pilots would conduct long-haul supply flights throughout the Korean War. There would be more wars to come, along with domestic and international relief missions and search and rescue operations. And now, the great frontier. In July 2022, the RCAF announced the formation of 3 Canadian Space Division to secure Canada's growing dependence on satellite technology. Apropos, considering the original Air Force motto, per ardua et astra, through adversity to the stars.